Hello, welcome to the channel and thanks for watching. So in this video I'm going to take you through what I've done with my Kill Team Octarius bases, how I've made them to blend into the gaming board, the tips and tricks that I've done for what I think are some very exciting bases that will really lift the quality of your completed figures when you've got there. So stick around if you want to see that. Now, as ever, typical YouTube stuff, if you like what I'm doing, subscribe down below, hit the bell, all that jazz, and check out Adam's Hobby Stuff on Facebook and Instagram. So I'm a massive fan of doing something different with your bases when you do any miniatures, no matter what the game system is. When I saw the Octarius board here, with all the sort of buried in bits of building and tyres and skulls all over it and rocks and things, I thought, right, that's going to be the theme for my bases. I didn't just want to do sand, and bits of rock and whatever. That would have looked absolutely fine, but I just wanted to go that extra level. So before I started building the buildings, dug out some blue stuff and made up some single part moulds of various parts of the terrain that I was then going to use as that kind of scatter on the bases. Now, I won't go through here about how to make blue stuff molds. I've got a whole separate video for that, which I'll link down below if you want to check that out. But it's one of those kind of tools in the arsenal that I use quite a lot. I find it very interesting for doing something pretty unique, but that can blend with the theme of your army. So made those molds. I knocked up sort of 5 pieces in quite large sections. You see here, and this is clearly larger than a base, but we'll deal with that in a second. And I've tried to cast up different parts of the scenery, so I've got something slightly different on each one. With the one you can see here with like a little indentation, so it's going to give depth to the model. Some are just like the metal panels, some here are like some cabling or whatever. So just 5 different bits, and that's what I would recommend you do. So we're going to have a coherent theme across the bases, but just something a little bit different on each one. And I really do think bases are a kind of often overlooked part of your model. You know, a brilliant model on a shoddy base looks far worse than it should. A slightly shoddy model on a brilliant base gets lifted a little bit. Hopefully we're going for a balance in between with sort of how we paint. So we've got the pieces ready, and this green stuff has now dried kind of overnight. And you can see here, that's the kind of concept. So skulls, the rock, you can see the vent fan that I've actually cast up sort of on there. Now, one thing you can't do yourself is probably make orc skulls. You could, but that's beyond me, sculpting those things. A really useful set to have knocking around is one of the Citadel Skull sets. Hundreds and hundreds of skulls in there. You know, you'd be probably using it for the next 5 years if you pick it up. I've also got some Basin Slates and very small stuff. This was from a workshop set many years ago, and the larger slate pieces complemented with little bits of stone that you find around the walks and whatever. Now, going on to the bases, obviously 2 different sizes because we're doing the orcs and we're doing the guard, and clearly the green stuff we've cast up is far too big to go on the base, so it's just now a simple case of cutting it down. Now, I don't want to just cut randomly. I want to try and make it as efficient as possible. Try and use as much of this green stuff with as least wastage as possible and make it sort of fit nicely on the base. So I've chosen to start on the outside edge. So you put the green stuff piece round, just use a bit of white paint to paint around the rim of the base to give you that guide that you're going to then cut it out with. And on each piece you'll be able to do 2 or 3 bases on there. You're not looking for perfection, but the more you can use out of it, the better. Slice it out with a super sharp hobby knife, obviously being very careful when you're doing it. And when you've cut it out from the green stuff piece itself, trim it down, trim off any overhanging pieces and just test fit it on the base, and you'll see that's now stage 1. So repeat that across as many bases as you want. Now, I wouldn't have a piece of that sunken terrain on every base, probably 3/4 of them, and leave some for the bare sand. Now, you will find when you've made these molds, there'll be bits where it won't quite be touching the base properly. If you're going to super glue it down, you want as much contact as possible. So, keep test fitting it on the base, and you can shave off any parts that are, slightly lumpy from when you've done it in the 1-part mold. When they're all stuck down and the super glue's had a little bit of time to dry, we're on to the next phase. Now, we want these pieces to look buried. Obviously now they'll look quite raised, so we need to raise that ground level up. So in my case, I've just used some milliput. You could use green stuff again, but it's more expensive, and milliput gives a slightly different effect. And then what we're doing is raising the ground level around the green stuff pieces you've put on. You don't need to go over the green stuff layer at this stage, because the next stage is going to take it over, but we're wanting to make sure that the pieces of the terrain don't look like they're sat on top of the sand. We want it to look buried like the game board does. So just use that milliput, wipe it down, and you need to be fairly fast through this because we're going to need this milliput to be slightly wet for the next stage. So now moving on to that very next stage. So we've seen here all the milliput's still wet. We've done all the bases. Important to know actually some of the bases I have done with the in-between parts where we've cut the bases out, so we've not actually wasted much because I've used some real tiny pieces. So now it's about using the skull set. So we're going to use a mixture of the human skulls, the orc skulls, you know, some jaws and that pieces. Cut out the one you think you like and literally press it into the still wet milliput. And that'll hold it in, that'll seal it in there. And again, I've not done one on every base, I just want it to be reflective of what the game board looks like. So I've used 2 or 3 human skulls, 2 or 3 orc skulls. Now then you need to leave this overnight, or at least for a good few hours for it to dry solid. And when it is, it's PVA glue time. So PVA glue onto all the milliput areas, because this is where the sand's going to be, and drift some of that PVA glue onto the green stuffed areas. And now I'm using a little bit of Basin Slate first on a small area and then the sand on top. Now you could use a pre-mix where you've got some little bits of gravel in with the sand. There are lots of stuff available, but this is literally play sand from a kid's play pit that I bought a massive bag of years ago, and some slate, which is what I've got. So use what you want to make it match how you like, but I do think different textures in there works really well. Now if you've gone too far with the PVA somewhere, you know, you've covered the skull by accident, or you've gone where you don't want to, before it dries, just slightly dampen a brush, not a good brush, you don't want to wreck it, and just use that to wipe off anything that you don't want, you know, away from the skulls and those moulded on areas. Now what we're going to do on some of the bases, and I'm choosing the bases that have got no green stuff parts on, I'm going to then put some slightly larger rocks, just with a dab of super glue, and a slightly larger stone onto there. And again, this is another part of that gaming map that we've seen, that just has the sand with the larger rocks in. So, you know, I've got some with no skulls whatsoever and no green stuff whatsoever, and just chosen to do a rock because you don't want every single base to look the same. And then same process, PVA, sand, as we've seen already. Now before we undercoat them and spray varnish them, go around with, you know, a dry brush or whatever, and just brush off any of the loose sand, because when you spray it, it can sometimes kind of seal in but then fall off later and leave a mark. So get anything that's not properly sealed rid of, and then it's time to undercoat. Now I've just sprayed these black, and then I've sprayed them with an army painter desert sand because it matches in, and then we'll go through the painting process in a second. So they look quite effective at this stage. They're not quite a colour match. I'm not going for an exact colour match, but we'll see what I do next. Now we're going to watch this at 6 speed. I wish I could paint this fast, it would be amazing. So now it's just about painting it as you're going to paint the gaming board. Now I'm going to be doing the octarius scenery just with a basic metal colour for the most part of it, so that's what we've chosen to do. We're going to pick out the details like the skulls in a bone colour, and I use one red colour just to do some cable, so I'm not going overboard in this terrain because, as I said before, a good base can really lift the model, but what you don't want to do is overwhelm the model with hundreds of colours and things on the bases, not in this case anyway, because, you know, of the style we're going for. So I've used a very simple silver colour, we put some red on, we've put a bone colour onto the skulls and things, and then we're doing an ink wash stage. Now I'm using null oil, you know, it's a Games Workshop favourite, onto all the metallic areas, and when that's thoroughly dried, I'm then using Agrax Earthshade onto, you know, the sand and the skulls and those. So 2 different wash colours on there because it'll give a really nice effect when, you know, it dries. So you could use any of the washes you want. You wouldn't necessarily have to do this stage if you'd never used null oil or don't want to use null oil. You know, you could paint these bases up exactly how you want, but back to normal speed. This is how the bases have dried after the wash stages, and actually it looks pretty nice. And if I wasn't going to match it to a game board, I'd probably stop there, or possibly stop there. But I'm going to go now back through and just do some highlighting layers. So going back over the models with the same colours we've already used. So the red, the slight metallics, some very gentle highlights. But then on the sand, we've used the desert yellow from Army Painter. It's like in a pot, a colour matched to the spray. But then we've done a lighter brown over all the sand. And we've not really touched the big rocks because we want slight differentiation. We've not touched the metal parts with that, but then a final really gentle highlight with a bleach bone colour just to lift that. And if that goes over the metal, that's great because it makes the metal look kind of dusty. So a fairly simple colour scheme. Hopefully you'll see it's fairly effective. It's close to the game board colour, but with enough contrast for it to really stand out. And hopefully when I get my kill team models on there, it'll really pop. So I hope you've enjoyed that. Hope you've taken some inspiration. If you have, as I said before, keep following the channel, and hopefully I will see you on here again soon. Cheers.